PodCastle, episode 520 from May 1st, 2018. One Day, My Dear, I'll Shower You with Rubies by Langley, Hyde. Hello everyone, and welcome to PodCastle. I'm your host and assistant editor, Setsu Uzume. Today's story is One Day, My Dear, I'll Shower You with Rubies by Langley, Hyde. Rated PG-13 for broken hearts and rolling heads. Langley Hyde's short fiction has recently appeared in Terraform, Persistent Visions, and Unidentified Funny Objects 6, edited by Alex Schwartzman. Her novel, High Fell Grimoires, was named a Best Book of 2014 in SF Fantasy and Horror by Publishers Weekly. She currently lives in the Pacific Northwest with her partner, 2 children, and a rickety old cat. Today's narrator is our own co-editor, Jen Albert. Jen Albert is 3 kingdoms tall, 1 sunbeam wide, and has the eyes of a spy master. But she won't tell me where. And now, keep your focus, ignore the press, and enjoy the story.
One Day, My Dear, I'll Shower You with Rubies by Langley, Hyde. Elusia Cooper, she said. I'm the only child of the accused, Varys Bloodrain. Her father, clean-shaven and dark-haired, sat at the defendant's bench. He looked exactly as he had when Fort Beatitude had fallen, about 30 years old. But then magic would do that. He even wore his iconic red leather robes, though his saber sheath and gun holster hung empty, and no torture implements glittered on his utility belt. He smiled at her. She smiled back. Guiltily, Elusia forced her face into a somber scowl. She breathed in the beeswax-scented air once, twice, to calm herself down. Her skin prickled with an uneasy sweat, and her green-worsted wool walking dress stuck to her back. She'd picked green because it had no associations with the war. The prosecutor, a narrow man with broad, bushy sideburns, rested his hand on the stand. What is your current occupation? I work with my husband, who is a barrel maker, she said. Her father would be so disappointed. After he read to her at night, he used to bend to kiss her on the forehead. One day, my dear, I'll shower you with rubies, and you'll inherit the earth. So Elusia let her pride show. We make the finest oak casks for wine and brandy in the Taffetshire region. Taffetshire? Yes. Elusia refused to elaborate. Taffetshire was predominantly Middish. Her husband had wished to live there to be closer to his family. How do you think your father feels about your interspecies marriage? Elusia couldn't see how that was relevant to the court's inquiry, but saying so wouldn't win her any accolades. She answered honestly instead. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him for 18 years. Her father had sent her letters, though, which she'd kept but never read. Once a month, like clockwork, they arrived in the mail. When did you last speak to him? On the day he was arrested. When the Allegiance stormed Fort Beatitude. The day her mother had died. Shot in the chest. Her father had been weeping when men in white uniforms had taken him away. I'll see you soon, my dear. Be strong. Be brave. The seats behind the defense were empty, and behind the prosecution packed. A young woman in a pink cotton day dress and straw bonnet sat in the prosecution's front row. She stared at Elusia with a particular black-eyed intensity. Had Elusia's father killed this woman's parents? Not a sibling, surely. She looked too young for that. A grandparent? Were you aware of your father's activities in Fort Beatitude? Some of them, not all of them. He'd come in through the gate. Let me scrub up, my dear. Then I can go play in the garden, unless you fancy a game of checkers. What did you know about his activities at the time? I was a child, she said. I understood that he was killing people, but because I never saw it, it didn't seem real to me. He told me it was necessary, and I believed him. I understood that he had to extract their blood and their souls using techniques that were very painful. Sometimes I could hear his prisoners screaming, but when I was 8 or so, he had the wall soundproof so he could work at night without waking me up. I knew that he was using these people's souls to animate his magic, including the Clockwork Army. I saw it on parade. What a grand day that had been. She'd been what, 8? She'd put on her prettiest dress and sat in a balcony with her mother and father. The TikToks marched past by the gleaming thousands on their way to invade Elland. She'd given them her best Queen of the World wave, the one she'd practiced in the mirror. All those TikToks. Could you provide an estimate as to how many he killed? She shook her head. Sometimes I sneaked up into the attic. From the garret window, I could see the TikToks marching the prisoners in. Usually they came in batches of between a dozen and about 50. And they came in every day. Except Sundays. Why not Sundays? Her gaze snapped up to meet the prosecutor's. Was he mocking her? No, he genuinely didn't know the answer to this question, that was all. And he was surprised that he didn't. She said, because we attended church on Sundays. After we were shriven, we usually had a garden party with his lieutenants. If it rained, we played checkers inside. How did he dispose of the bodies? He had a dump behind a hill to the north. In the summer, when the wind blew in from that direction, the stench had been unbearable. Crows would swirl up from that mass grave, so many they'd dizzy her when she tried to count them, cawing so loud no one could speak and be heard. In the winter, though, that pit flooded and froze. She'd gone ice skating there with her father. I remind the judge and jury, the prosecutor said, that a diagram of Fort Beatitude and the surrounding areas has been provided along with the other paper evidence. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Cooper. She nodded, faintly. She wanted to put her head down in her arms, inhale that sweet smell of beeswax and fall asleep. She wanted to stay asleep, then wake to find that the trial had finished without her. No, that her childhood had been a dream. Better to have a mind capable of concocting such horrors than for this to have been her life. Even better would be to go home, to her husband. Would the defense like to cross-examine the final witness? The judge asked. Her father's defender stepped forward. He wore a rust-colored twill suit, and his mustachioed face bore the earnest nervousness of a man who really, really did not want to be here. But he approached her anyway, like a rat in a moment of insane daring, scuttling up to a cat. Mrs. Cooper, he said, thank you for revisiting what must have been very painful to you. What could she say to that? Could you describe your father's motivations in doing what he did? He believed he deserved to rule the world, she said, and that he could do it better than anyone else because he was more thoughtful and intelligent. Are those the thoughts of a sane man? How would I know? I'm not a doctor. Objection, the prosecution said. Sustained, the judge said. Did your father display any aberrant, irrational, or otherwise unusual behavior? The defense asked. Elusia blinked. What's not aberrant and unusual about what I've just described? Excuse me, I'll define my question further. Did your father ever display fits of extreme temper? Was he ever cruel, only to switch without a moment's notice to kindness? Was the defense attempting to justify her father's actions by insinuating that her father had been unsound of mind? Elusia doubted anyone would believe that. Besides, it hadn't been true. He was a remarkably even-tempered man, from what I can remember. He was very disciplined and very kind to animals. After dinner, we usually played checkers. Can you describe your childhood to the court? How could he ask that, with her father sitting there? Her father nodded, slightly. He knew. His gaze rested on her, sad and bleak. She had to tell the truth. She was under oath. More, she owed it to him, as much as she owed him anything. She owed it to herself. She couldn't hate her father as much as she wished she could. She swallowed past the tightness in her throat. Happy, she said, choked. My childhood was happy. And that, to her, was the worst thing about it. After the judge adjourned the court to deliberate, Illusia left the stand. As everyone else filed out the back, there was a soft murmur. Would her father's trial provide them with a resolution that his lieutenant's trials had not? Would it allow her to put this all behind her? Finally? Maybe. She doubted it. She ducked her head so she wouldn't have to look at her father, touched her black hat to make sure it was still sturdily pinned to her chignon, then headed out the door. She could feel him looking at her. He wanted her to look at him. She wouldn't. She couldn't. In the doorway out, the woman in pink grabbed her arm. Illusia stopped, startled, and stared at her. Illusia's police escort, assigned to her for her safety, didn't seem alarmed, though. They knew the woman. But still, Illusia tensed. Whose death would she have to apologize for this time? She hated that she could never tell them how anyone died. That always made them angriest at her. What do you think of the prosecutor? The woman probed her, oddly insistent. He's good. As good as the defense was bad. But then there was no defense, was there? He's my father, the woman said, and smiled faintly. These trials have been his life's work. Illusia didn't know what to say to that either. The prosecutor, down on the steps leading out to the cobblestone street, hadn't looked back, not once. He was giving an interview to the journalists. He gestured expansively, and photographers snapped pictures. Illusia turned her face so it wouldn't make the Capital Times cover. Do you like coffee? The prosecutor's daughter asked. Illusia froze. Why? My father's rather busy. He said he might be able to make time for me after the trial. Have lunch. It's always after the trial. The woman in pink, the prosecutor's daughter, scrutinized Illusia. What did she search for? Similarities? They were there. No. Illusia summoned her dignity. No, thank you. You're very lucky, the prosecutor's daughter said. In your own way, you do know that, right? Lucky. The word seared through Illusia. For an incandescent moment, she wanted to hit the prosecutor's daughter. Only the nearby journalists stopped her. They'd love it, wouldn't they, if they caught Bloodrain's daughter slapping the prosecutor's daughter? She'd be cover-page material for years. A daughter like the father, they'd say. She had to be careful. Calm and careful. But not too calm. If she were a better person, she wouldn't have held back because of the journalists. She would have held back because it was wrong to hurt this woman. Perhaps the journalists would be right. Like father, like daughter. Lucky. How could this woman say that, knowing what Illusia's father had done? Lucky to have a father like him? Illusia couldn't formulate a reply, any reply to the prosecutor's daughter. She tore her arm from the woman's grip. She could feel her father's gaze hanging on her back, begging for recognition. She refused to give it to him, to even acknowledge him with a backwards glance. That would be too much like forgiveness. Illusia sat on her hotel's plush red carpet. She'd opened her steamer trunk. It smelled like oak chips, like wood smoke, like home. And she'd spread out her father's letters. In some, he joked about prison life. The Fort Beatitude reunion, he'd called it. His letters became sadder once they'd started executing his lieutenants. One read, simply, "Today they came for Illodard." Illusia remembered Illodard from Sunday afternoons. A tall man who smiled rarely. He'd collected buttons. Illusia had loved his golden retriever, a big bouncy dog named Chuckles. Sometimes in his letters, her father speculated about her life. Had she continued her magical studies at the university? He couldn't have known that a special law had passed preventing the children of the unification from attending university for 7 generations. Did she have children? No. Never. You're very lucky. She wanted to spit on the letters, to burn them, to turn toward her husband, press her face into his darkly furred chest, to let his rumbling voice soothe her. She missed the look in his golden, hook-pupiled eyes. How, when his arms tightened around her, she could pretend someone understood. Illusia smoothed the letters into a crescent moon. She shouldn't have brought them. She shouldn't have brought the small portable checkers board either. The one that she'd purchased to take on picnics with her husband and then never played on. She'd never been able to bring herself to do it. She shouldn't be here. She had to be here. She wished they'd killed her too on the day they took Fort Beatitude. Then she unwished it. She couldn't regret falling in love. How do you think your father feels about that? She couldn't know. She had to know. She packed the fold-up checkerboard into her valise and stood. She opened the hotel room door. 2 policemen stood outside. "Could you please take me to my father?" she said. Her father no longer wore his red leather robes. A show, she realized, for the court and the journalists outside it. He was dressed in a steel gray jumpsuit. He sat on his bunk and gazed at her, at first delighted and astonished, then somber and thoughtful. His eyes were fine and dark. He seemed so young because of all the magic he'd done. She realized with a start that he probably looked younger than she did. He looked like a kid. She waited patiently for him to speak. In a way, she'd gotten that from him. Making a good barrel required time. It was a craft that could not be hurried. For wine and brandy barrels, no cheap tricks like plugging the gaps with tar would do. No, that would ruin the flavor. Each stave had to fit perfectly against the other. They had to be tight enough, but not too tight. They had to be perfect. She made barrels with a blood magician's fanatical attention to detail. "You've grown up," he said. "Yes." "No magic, then?" "No." She didn't mention the law against it. Why bother? When did you meet him?" He laughed, a little self-consciously. "You have to tell me everything, please. Tell me everything." "He worked at the refugee camp I was relocated to." She'd been alone, rummaging through the trash at the camp's edge. Other prisoners never spoke to her. They tripped her when she stood in line for rations. After 2 days, she'd learned to avoid everyone. The midman who'd become her husband, patrolling the wire fence for breaks, had seen her. In that moment, she'd heard her father's voice. "They're animals, mere byproducts of human experimentation with magic. Our creations. They're meant to serve, to die." Her one-day husband had recognized Blood Rain's daughter. He'd held out his canteen anyway. With that gesture, her understanding flipped. She felt the same, like a strong marble column eaten at by the rain, but everything around her had inverted. "When the camp closed, his tour of duty ended with the allegiance," she continued. "He'd been conscripted. He asked me to come with him. His father was a cooper. We've been married for 12 years. "He's a midman, isn't he?" her father said. Yes, he is." She waited for his condemnation, for the words he'd spoken so casually, so gently at the dinner table. "Animals, upstarts, Elland, a country for midmen? What will they want next?" Sometimes she still butted up against the beliefs he'd instilled in her. Just the other day, she'd called a Minish customer's annoyed growl bestial. Her husband had only looked at her, looked until shame heated her cheeks. He understood the hatred she'd been fed better than she did herself. But all her father said was, "You'll never have children, then?" No. It was for the best anyway. "Remember what I used to tell you," he said. "You used to tell me a lot of things." "I'll cover you in rubies and—" "One day, my dear," she repeated, her voice toneless with pain. "I'll shower you with rubies and you'll inherit the earth." "Yes, that was it," he sighed. His gaze drifted away from hers, and she sensed words coiling inside him. He cleared his throat and looked back towards her. "I'm sorry." Her heart pounded. This was it. He would finally express remorse. He'd finally say it and understand what he'd done. After all of yesterday's testimonies from his victims' families, how could he not? After seeing his own daughter take the stand against him, he had to get it. "For what?" she asked. "I wish I'd been able to keep my promise to you. You deserve better." She looked down at her hands. Her eyes blurred with tears. Sometimes she dreamed of her childhood. Sweet sunlit dreams where she ran amid the legs of his lieutenants, where he chased her and she hid under the table where they played checkers. In her dreams, he always found her and tickled her. Her father would never get why, when she woke up, sobs racked her, because those happy dreams were nightmares only because they were true. She'd cry until she choked while her husband helplessly patted her back. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. Not anymore. She took a few rapid breaths. "Why don't we play one last game of checkers?" she said. He smiled. "I'd like that." They played 2 games. She lost both because she couldn't concentrate, and when the prison guards asked her to leave, her father lay back on his bunk, smiling. "Thank you for visiting," he said. "Goodbye," she said. "Father." The verdict was unanimous. She attended the execution. She did not think she would, but she did. She, after much thought, had selected black. She was the only one in black. She sat down in a box with the prosecutor, his daughter, and the defense. They were close, very close, to the sand-strewn arena where Middish had once been forced to fight, forced to kill one another. Today, a podium had been erected in the middle. A tick-tock stood on it, with its hands resting on the axe between its feet. It looked more like an empty suit of ornamental armor than the world's most fearsome killing machine. Aluja hadn't seen a tick-tock in years. Most had been disbanded after the war, their blood drained and the souls animating them laid to rest. But not this one. One last tick-tock to furnish the world with poetic justice. Would they hang it in a museum? The tick-tock that slew Varys Bloodrain. 100 years from now, would a conservator polish its brassy breastplate, its gears, its blank-faced helm, and imagine what it had been like to be an allegiant soldier facing an enemy that did not sleep, could not feel pain, an enemy that never stopped or wound down? Whose soul lived in this tick-tock, preserved in agony to provide this satisfying moment to the crowds? Had she once watched this poor person march into Fort Beatitude from her garret? "I didn't think I'd see you here," the prosecutor's daughter said. Aluja couldn't say that she was glad to be here. She didn't know how she felt. She suspected that, however long she thought about it, she never would. She said only, "I'm here." Her father had been there, after all, when she was born. It's only right that she was here when he died. Behind them, the wooden risers were silent but packed, predominantly with Middish, wearing white sashes across their otherwise bare furred chests. Humans also wore the sashes, over their suits and day dresses. Somehow, the women's colorful bonnets seemed bizarre to Aluja, fashionably bedecked with paper flowers and festive wax fruits. Even so, the mood of the crowd was not celebratory. It was tense, anticipating catharsis. Her father came out into the arena, white uniformed guards at his sides. Again, he wore his iconic red robes. She didn't mind the stagecraft, because her father had loved such things in his day, though the gesture did seem somehow petty to her. Her father looked right at her. She pushed up her veil so that he could see her eyes. She met his gaze and did not flinch. "Goodbye, Father." The guards fixed a black bag over her father's head. Her father let them guide him up the steps. He had never walked so hesitantly as he did now. To see his confidence shattered like this broke her heart in a strange way, just as it would break her heart to see a man-eating wolf shot or a river's violence dammed. He'd always had that air to him, a force of nature, and his laws to her had seemed like the laws of the universe. Once. Yet him being so small and scared, that too was right. Her father knelt, willingly, and placed his head on the block. She hoped one day she'd be able to forgive him for being a good father, for loving her. But for right now, all she could do was forgive herself for loving him. For loving a man who was kind to a slobbery golden retriever named Chuckles, who played checkers with her when it rained, who'd gone ice skating with her in the winter, who used to read to her every night and promise her the world. The tick-tock's axe flashed down. Aluja could not look, not at the sands. The tick-tock saluted the crowd with its blade, and a thin spatter of blood decorated the rail near Alucia's hands. Each droplet quivered, round and gleaming and perfect, a strand of rubies that would not last in the sun's heat. She stared at them, her fingers clenched, white-knuckled. She would not cry, not in front of the prosecutor's daughter, not in front of the journalists or the crowds. She'd wait. She'd hold it back until home, but she knew it would explode from her the first time she smelled wood smoke on her husband's fur. She'd weep until her father's death folded into her, became a part of the past in the same way her and her marriage had become part of her country's future. It was her father's legacy. Her marriage was the result of his actions. She would spend her old age in the world he had, strangely, made for her. "You're very lucky." Alucia let go of the rail and turned her back on the gleaming droplets quivering there. She did not look back at her father's body. She walked down those wooden steps and placed her feet on the land that had somehow, miraculously, survived.
And welcome back. There's a strange moment in every relationship when the individual splits into two beings, the archetype in that relationship and the actual person involved. The concept of what a mother is and the person who birthed you. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they really, really don't. We love stories of ascent, when the underdog nobody rises to their circumstances and becomes more than their history or hang-ups. But the opposite happens as well, and it's so jarring. The worst part of that kind of disillusion is that it makes you doubt your own senses and judgment. You can't control what happens, but you can control your response to it. Whether that moment becomes a deeper understanding or a total shattering, that's entirely up to you. If there are formal terms for any of these psychological processes, hit me up on Twitter, I'd love to know. Finally, I'd like to note that Langley Hyde originally wrote this story for Kat Rambo's Writing FNSF course, and she owes a special thanks to writing group members Alexi Collier, Rebecca Brockway, and ZM Quinn for their feedback. Also, I have some truly exciting news. Our own associate editor Aidan Doyle has teamed up with our beloved alumna Rachel K. Jones and the incomparable E. Catherine Tobler of Shimmer to create Sword and Sonnet, an anthology of battle poets. The final lineup has been released and we are thrilled to see a lot of familiar names on there, including Khalida Muhammad Ali, Matt Dovey, Malin Edwards, Spencer Ellsworth, Cassandra Carr, Tony Pye, A. Merck Rustad, C.S.E. Cooney, and A.C. Wise, alongside a ton of other fabulous authors. Check out their website at swordsonnet.com to see some beautiful artwork and order yourself a copy. And that's our story for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, our co-editors Jen Albert and Khalida Muhammad Ali, our audio producer Spencer Ellsworth, and our forum moderator Asikat, as well as all of our associate editors, Sui Davies Okungboa, Eleanor Wood, Aidan Doyle, Crystal Claxton, Raj Gopal, Stephen Capps, Matt Dovey, Devin Martin, Elora Gatz, Arun Jiwa, Stephanie Cox, Julia Pat, Hamilton Perez, and Naru Sundar. Thanks for letting us share another story with you. We've got to fly, but we'll be back next week with another tale. See you then.